Welcome to Suri Cheating Story, where we share true stories of betrayal in love. Our channel brings heartfelt, real-life experiences from those who have endured the pain of infidelity. Whether you're facing challenges in your own relationship or seeking to better understand the complexities of love and trust, Suri Cheating Story is the place for you. Subscribe now to explore the emotional depths in the path to healing with us. It was a gray morning in New York City. The skies were heavy with rain, and the streets glistened with puddles from the downpour. Jake Miller, a 24-year-old law student, trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His face, young yet burdened with the weight of the world, betrayed the exhaustion of someone fighting to keep their head above water. The pressure was overwhelming. As the son of a man who had died leaving behind mountains of debt, Jake had been trying to pay his dues ever since. His final year of law school was supposed to be his ticket out, but his mounting debts and the relentless pursuit of creditors made it feel more like a trap he couldn't escape. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and answered with a tone that mirrored his weariness. "Jake Miller speaking," he said, trying to sound composed despite the chaos swirling inside. A smooth, authoritative voice responded. "Mr. Miller, this is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to speak with you regarding your financial situation." Jake's brow furrowed. "Eleanor Whitmore, who are you? How do you know about me?" The voice on the other end didn't falter. "I know enough," she said, cutting him off. "Let's meet at the coffee house at 7 p.m. It's urgent." The line went dead before Jake could protest. Confused but intrigued, he made his way to the cafe later that evening. The rain had intensified, and his jacket did little to shield him from the downpour. When he arrived, the warmth of the cafe enveloped him, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint scent of rain that had followed him inside. At a corner table sat Eleanor Whitmore, a striking woman in her late 60s. Her silver hair was styled impeccably, and she wore a tailored suit that radiated wealth and power. She looked every bit the part of a successful businesswoman. Her eyes were a piercing shade of blue, sharp and calculating, and her smile was almost too perfect to be real. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him, her voice calm yet commanding, as if she were accustomed to people obeying her every word. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Please sit." Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with questions. Who was this woman, and how did she know about his situation? "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, taking the seat cautiously. "What's this about?" Without missing a beat, Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and deliberate. "I know about your father's debts," she said, locking eyes with him. "I know you're struggling to make ends meet, and I'm here to offer you a solution." Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. His stomach churned as the reality of his financial situation hit him once again. And what kind of solution would that be? Eleanor set her teacup down, her gaze unwavering. "Marry me," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, as if she were making a business proposal. "I'll pay off all your debts. I'll ensure your financial future. In exchange, you'll become my husband." Jake blinked, stunned. "Wait. What? You're serious?" Her expression didn't change. "I am," she replied calmly. "This isn't about love, Jake. This is a business arrangement. Think of it as a contract. You'll get what you need and I'll get what I need." "Why me?" Jake asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You don't even know me." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. "Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this." "I don't need love, Jake. I need someone to share my name, my estate. I need a companion, even if it's just for appearances." Jake shook his head, his thoughts spinning. "This is insane. What's in it for you?" Eleanor's eyes softened slightly for the first time. "I've spent my life alone," she said, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. "No children, no family. I want companionship, even if it's just for the sake of appearances. And I need control over my legacy. A husband will help solidify that." Jake stood abruptly, pushing his chair back, the sound of it scraping across the floor echoing in the quiet cafe. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of this surreal proposition. "I can't. I need time to think." Eleanor's demeanor didn't change. "Of course," she said coolly, "but don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever." The following days felt like a blur to Jake, each one passing in a haze of doubt and indecision. He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's offer. Her cold, calculated words had drilled into his mind, echoing relentlessly. The weight of his father's debts was like a ball and chain around his legs, and no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't escape its grip. His mother's health was deteriorating, and the medical bills were piling up. His sister's college tuition hung over their heads like a storm cloud, threatening to drown them. Jake had always believed that hard work and integrity were the keys to success, but the reality he faced now was far from that ideal. No amount of late-night studying or odd jobs was going to solve his problems. He was sinking, and his family was sinking with him. What choice did he have? That night, sitting across from his mother at the kitchen table, the dim light from the old chandelier flickered, casting long shadows across her tired face. She was stirring a pot of soup, her hands shaking slightly, betraying the stress she had been under for years. The room was quiet, the silence heavy with the weight of unspoken words. His mother had always been strong, but Jake could see the cracks beginning to form. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I know this is hard for you, but if Eleanor Whitmore is offering to help, maybe it's worth considering. We've been struggling for so long. You've tried everything else, but we're running out of time." Jake felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had been trying to protect his family, trying to keep their heads above water, but it was clear he was failing. His mother, who had always been his rock, was now looking to him for salvation. The weight of her gaze pressed down on him, and for the first time he truly understood the magnitude of their situation. "I can't marry her, Mom," Jake muttered, his voice cracking with emotion. "This feels wrong. She's a stranger. I can't just sell myself like that." His mother's face softened. Her eyes filled with a sorrow he couldn't bear to see. "I understand, Jake, but what other choice do we have? We're barely keeping our heads above water. If she's offering you a way out, don't let pride be the thing that sinks us." The words stung, but Jake knew deep down she was right. Pride couldn't keep them afloat. His father's mistakes were now his burden, and the life he had dreamed of, the life he had worked so hard for, was slipping through his fingers. "I'll do it," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The decision settled like a heavy stone in his stomach. He wasn't proud of it, but he knew he had no other options. If this was the only way to save his family, he would do it, no matter the cost. The next day, Jake made his way back to the coffee house, the familiar streets of New York now feeling like a maze of anxiety and regret. The rain had started to fall again, as though the weather itself was reflecting his inner turmoil. He arrived at the cafe, the warmth inside offering little comfort against the cold storm in his mind. Eleanor was waiting at their usual corner table, her posture as immaculate as ever. She didn't look up when Jake walked in, but her presence was undeniable. There was an air of certainty about her, a quiet power that made him feel small and insignificant in comparison. She had already made her decision about him. Now he had to make his. Jake sat down across from her, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't look her in the eye. He had no idea what he was walking into, but the desperation was overwhelming. "I've decided," Jake said, his voice strained. "I'll do it." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone who had just secured another victory. "Good," she said simply. "The arrangements will be made immediately." Her words felt like a decree, and Jake's chest tightened as he realized that, for better or worse, his life had just changed irrevocably. The deal was made, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed, Jake found himself swept up in the logistics of his new life. The courthouse ceremony was arranged swiftly, with all the necessary paperwork drawn up in advance. It wasn't a wedding in any traditional sense. It was a transaction, plain and simple. The vows they exchanged were sterile, devoid of emotion, just legal words to seal the deal. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Jake couldn't shake the cold feeling that had settled in his bones. He wasn't a husband. He was a business partner, a pawn in a much larger game. He felt no joy, no relief. All he could think about was his family, and how he would explain this to his mother, to his sister. But there was no time to dwell on that. Eleanor led him to her estate, the massive gates creaking open as their car rolled up the long driveway. The mansion that loomed ahead was more like a fortress than a home, its towering columns and grand facade more suited for a museum than a place to live. The house was silent and imposing, the windows dark and lifeless. Jake stepped out of the car, the weight of the mansion pressing down on him. He felt like an intruder in someone else's world, a world that had no place for him. He followed Eleanor into the house, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. The house felt cold, like a place where warmth and human connection had long since been abandoned. Eleanor greeted him with her usual cool, practiced smile. "Welcome, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7. Jake nodded mutely, his mind still reeling from the whirlwind that had brought him here. He was trapped now, bound by a contract that would shape the rest of his life. He couldn't help but wonder. What was he really getting himself into? That night, Jake sat at the long dining table, Eleanor at the other end, her posture as perfect as ever. The food was rich, extravagant, far beyond anything Jake had ever seen. But the opulence of the meal only made the situation feel more surreal. The staff moved around them silently, as if they were all part of some elaborate performance. Eleanor's voice broke the silence, calm and deliberate. "I trust you're settling in?" she asked, her gaze never wavering from her plate. "It's different," Jake replied, his voice shaky. "This place is huge. I feel like I'll get lost." Eleanor smirked, her eyes gleaming with a certain cold amusement. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, you're here now." The words stung more than Jake cared to admit. He wasn't here by choice. He was here because he had no other option. But as Eleanor's gaze lingered on him, he realized he wasn't just trapped by his circumstances. He was trapped in her game now, and there was no telling where it would lead. Jake had never felt more out of place than he did in the grand dining room that evening. The extravagant meal laid before him seemed like an elaborate illusion, a distraction from the cold reality that now defined his life. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself trying to make conversation with Eleanor, but every word felt rehearsed, calculated. She was a master of controlling every interaction, always remaining a step ahead of him, her cold eyes never leaving his face. "So, Jake," Eleanor began, her voice smooth as velvet, "how are you adjusting to your new life?" Jake's hand tightened around his wine glass as he forced a smile. "It's different," he replied, struggling to mask the unease that had taken root deep inside him. "I'm still getting used to the size of everything here. This house is enormous." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a subtle smile. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, it's where you belong now." Her words were like a dagger, sharp and precise. The finality in her tone made Jake feel more like a prisoner than a husband. He glanced around the room, taking in the opulence of the estate, the gleaming chandeliers, the marble floors, the antique furniture. It all felt like a gilded cage, beautiful but suffocating. This was the life Eleanor had built for herself, a life that was as cold and distant as she was. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself, leaving Jake alone at the table with his thoughts. The silence in the massive room was deafening, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had married a woman he barely knew, for reasons he still didn't fully understand. She was offering him a way out of his financial struggles, but at what cost? He had sold his soul to escape his debts, but what would he have to give up in the process? Later that evening, Jake wandered the halls of the mansion, the vast space amplifying the sense of isolation that had begun to settle over him. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of the house bearing down on him like a prison. He passed locked doors, their gleaming brass handles catching the dim light, and couldn't help but wonder what secrets they held. There was something about the house that felt wrong. It wasn't just the grandeur or the coldness of it. It was the sense that it was hiding something. Something dark. Jake found himself in the library, the large room filled with the scent of old books and polished wood. He ran his fingers across the spines of the books, their titles faded with age. It was quiet here, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. But even in the quiet, Jake could feel the unease growing inside him. As he walked past Eleanor's desk, something caught his eye. A small, ornate key was lying on the surface, its intricate design gleaming in the low light. Jake felt a surge of curiosity. What could it be for? He glanced around the room to make sure no one was watching, then reached for it. The key was cold to the touch, heavier than he expected. It felt important, like it held the answer to a question he didn't even know he had. Heart racing, Jake slipped the key into his pocket, his mind spinning with possibilities. Was this the key to one of the locked doors he had seen earlier? Or was it something else? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to find it. As he left the library, he felt the weight of the key in his pocket, a constant reminder that there was something more to this place than he could see. That night, Jake lay awake in his luxurious but suffocating room, his mind racing. The silence in the house was overwhelming, and the weight of the key pressing against his side only added to his sense of unease. What was Eleanor hiding? Why had she chosen him for this twisted arrangement? He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to look. The next morning, he couldn't resist any longer. He needed to know what the key opened. He had seen a door earlier, at the end of a long hallway that had caught his attention. The handle was ornate, much like the key, and something about it seemed significant. He had to find out what was behind it. Jake crept down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. As he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was around. He could feel the weight of Eleanor's watchful eyes, even if she wasn't physically present. There was no turning back now. With a trembling hand, Jake slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door creaked open. The room inside was unlike anything he had imagined. It was a time capsule, frozen in another era. Dusty furniture and faded wallpaper surrounded him, and the air was thick with the smell of neglect. But it was the photographs that caught his attention. On a table in the corner were several tarnished silver frames, their images capturing happier times. There was Eleanor as a young woman, standing beside a man who must have been her late husband, and another couple Jake didn't recognize. But it was the stack of papers on the desk that truly caught his attention. As he flipped through them, his eyes widened. Legal documents. They detailed failed business deals between Eleanor's late husband, Harold Whitmore, and Jake's father. And then he found a letter, a sharp, angry letter accusing Jake's father of fraud. It was a letter full of venom, condemning his father for ruining Eleanor's family and leaving them with nothing. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The words were like a slap to the face. It seemed that Eleanor's hatred for his father ran deeper than he had ever realized. But there was something else. As he flipped to the last page, his heart stopped. There, in black and white, was a marriage license. It had Jake's name on it and Eleanor's. But the date was weeks before their wedding, far earlier than he had known. Suddenly, everything clicked. This wasn't just a business arrangement, it was a trap. Eleanor had orchestrated this entire situation, using him as a pawn in a game that had started long before he ever entered the picture. He had been chosen, not because of who he was, but because of who his father had been. Jake felt a surge of panic, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? What had he agreed to? As he stood there frozen, the door creaked behind him. He spun around, his heart racing. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her icy gaze locking with his. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked, her voice sharp and cold. Jake's blood ran cold. "What is all of this? Why did you really marry me?" His voice was low, filled with a mix of fear and anger. Eleanor's eyes darkened. "You wouldn't understand, Jake, but you will. Soon enough." Her words hung in the air, leaving Jake with more questions than answers. He was in over his head, and he didn't know how to get out. Eleanor's cold gaze didn't falter as she stepped into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, all Jake could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He had thought he understood the game he was playing, but the discovery in the hidden room, the marriage license and the ominous letter had shattered everything. This was no simple arrangement. He was caught in a web of secrets, revenge, and a history he hadn't been prepared to face. Eleanor's presence was suffocating, her composed, calculating demeanor giving nothing away. "What are you going to do?" "Jake," she asked, her voice almost too soft, too patient, as though she were waiting for him to make his move. "I want answers," Jake shot back, his voice firm, though his stomach twisted with unease. "Why me? Why marry me? I don't understand. All this isn't just about money, is it? It's about my father, isn't it?" Eleanor's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something Something sharp, almost like a memory of pain, before it was gone, masked by her usual icy exterior. She crossed the room slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "Your father was a good businessman," she said slowly, her voice colder than the marble floors beneath their feet. "But he was also a liar, a thief, and a manipulator. He ruined my family, Jake, took everything from us. My husband died because of him, stressed and heartbroken from the financial ruin your father left behind." Jake's chest tightened at the mention of his father's role in Eleanor's pain. His father had always been the kind of man who'd smiled in the face of adversity, pushing forward with unshakable confidence. But Jake had no idea that his dealings had destroyed so many lives. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that the sins of his father were not only his inheritance, but his burden to bear. "I had no part in that," Jake said quietly, his voice cracking slightly, though he fought to keep his composure. "I'm not him. I didn't do anything to you." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "No, you didn't. But you are your father's son, and that is enough for me to use you as my pawn in this game. This is not about love or companionship, Jake. It's about control. Control of the legacy. Control of what was lost." Her voice dropped to a whisper, heavy with bitterness. "It's about revenge." Jake's stomach churned as the weight of her words sank in. He had thought he was entering into a simple contract, a way out of the crippling debts his father had left behind. But he now realized that he had been manipulated into a much larger scheme. A scheme of vengeance that stretched back years before he was even born. "You lied to me," Jake muttered, his fist clenching at his sides. "You used me to get back at my father. This marriage isn't about saving me. It's about destroying him, even after he's gone." Eleanor didn't deny it. In fact, she seemed almost pleased by his realization. "Exactly," she said, her tone triumphant. "Your father's death didn't undo the damage he caused. But this will make sure his legacy is buried along with him. It will make sure he never rises again." Jake's mind reeled with everything he had learned in the past few hours. It was as if his whole world had been flipped upside down. His desperation for a way out of his family's debts had led him into the hands of a woman who had no intention of letting him go. This marriage wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a trap, a means to exact revenge on his father through him. He had been nothing more than a pawn in Eleanor's twisted game. "I'm not going to be your pawn," Jake said through gritted teeth, his voice filled with newfound resolve. "You can't control me. I'm not my father." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "You think you have a choice, Jake? You think you can just walk away from this? You signed a contract. You agreed to this. There's no turning back now." Jake felt his anger surge. He had been manipulated, used like a chess piece in a game he didn't even know he was playing. But he wasn't willing to let her win. Not like this. Not at the cost of his integrity. Not at the cost of his future. "Then I'll find a way out," Jake said, his voice steady, though his pulse raced. "I'll find a way to expose you for who you really are. I won't be your pawn anymore." "Eleanor." Eleanor's gaze hardened, her eyes narrowing as she took a step closer to him. "You think you can outsmart me, Jake? You think you can fight me and win? You have no idea what you're up against. I've spent my life building this empire, manipulating every move, every detail. You can't escape." Jake's heart pounded as he stood his ground, meeting her eyes with defiance. He had been trapped in this situation for too long, but the more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Eleanor might have the power, the wealth, and the control, but he had something she didn't, his own will, and he wasn't going to let her break him. Over the next few days, Jake began to carefully observe everything around him. He listened to the staff, who spoke in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't paying attention. He noticed the strange, cryptic conversations between Eleanor and her lawyer, and the way the house seemed to shift from one secret to another, hidden behind locked doors and whispered promises. The mansion had always felt like a gilded cage, but now it felt like a house of lies. He couldn't escape. Not yet, but he would find a way. He had to. That evening, after a tense dinner where Eleanor barely acknowledged his presence, Jake retired to his room, his mind buzzing with the information he had gathered. He had seen Eleanor's meticulous planning, the subtle manipulation that she had woven into every interaction. But he was done playing her game. It was time to take control, to stop being her puppet. The key that he had stolen from the hidden room still burned a hole in his pocket. He had no idea what he would find behind the other locked doors in the mansion, but he was determined to uncover every secret. He couldn't let Eleanor keep using him, couldn't let her continue with her plans. He had a life to take back, a future to reclaim. Jake couldn't sleep. The tension in the mansion was suffocating, and the weight of everything he had learned pressed down on him like an invisible force. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the key from the hidden room still nestled in his pocket. He had to do something, anything, to break free from this twisted arrangement. The pieces of the puzzle were all around him, and for the first time since he'd stepped into this house, he felt like he had control of his own fate. The next day, Jake made a plan. He spent hours scouring Eleanor's private documents, her carefully hidden files, all while avoiding her prying eyes. There was so much more to her story, so much more that he hadn't seen, and he knew that the truth was his only weapon. He couldn't fight Eleanor with strength, but he could fight her with knowledge, with the power of the truth that she had so carefully tried to bury. Late that evening, as the mansion fell into its usual eerie stillness, Jake found what he was looking for, a hidden folder locked away in Eleanor's study. He had been cautious, aware that she was always watching, but this time he had managed to slip past her vigilance. The folder was full of documents, financial records, court cases, and a letter that sent chills down his spine. It was a letter from Eleanor's late husband, Harold Whitmore, written shortly before his death. In it, he confessed that he had been complicit in the fraudulent deals that had ruined both his and Jake's father's businesses. Eleanor's entire vendetta was built on a lie. Her husband had been just as guilty as Jake's father, and the destruction of their families wasn't a one-sided affair. Eleanor had spent years blaming Jake's family, but in reality, her own husband had contributed to the collapse. Jake felt a surge of anger, not at Eleanor, but at the situation, at the years of manipulation. He had been a pawn in her revenge game, but now, armed with this truth, he could finally take control of his future. He confronted Eleanor the next day in the same grand dining room where their marriage had been signed. Under the weight of her cold, calculating eyes, he placed the letter in front of her, watching as her composure cracked for the first time. "Eleanor," he said firmly, "you've spent all this time plotting your revenge, but you've been deceiving yourself. Your husband was just as responsible for what happened to your family as my father was. The truth was right in front of you the whole time." Eleanor stared at the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't speak for a long time, her gaze fixed on the words that had shattered the foundation of everything she'd believed in. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, almost regretful. "You're right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so consumed by my anger that I lost sight of everything else. I wanted to punish your family for what they did to me, but I never stopped to consider the truth." Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "You've hurt so many people, Eleanor, but it's not too late to make things right." For a long moment, Eleanor didn't respond. Then slowly she stood, her once cold eyes now filled with a mix of sadness and something resembling hope. Maybe it's time to let go of the past," she murmured. "Maybe it's time to stop living in the shadows." It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The weight of the past hadn't been erased, but it had been acknowledged. And for the first time, Eleanor seemed willing to move on. Jake didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he could ever fully trust Eleanor, but he realized that forgiveness wasn't just for the person who wronged you. It was for yourself. It was about finding peace and moving forward, no matter how hard it seemed. Months later, the estate was sold and Jake used the proceeds to pay off his mother's medical bills and ensure that his sister could finish her education. He found a sense of purpose again, returning to law school with a renewed focus on helping those who had been hurt by people like Eleanor, who had used their power for personal gain. He never heard from Eleanor again, but he didn't need to. The truth had set them both free. Eleanor had found a way to let go of the past, and Jake had found a way to reclaim his future. And as Jake walked out of the courthouse one final time, the weight of the past finally lifting, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. He was no longer trapped by his father's mistakes or by the machinations of a woman seeking revenge. He was free, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the city. Jake glanced up, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to face it head-on. And as he walked toward the horizon, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would be the author of his own story. If you find this story interesting and want to see more touching, tense, but meaningful situations, don't forget to subscribe to our channel today. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share this story with your friends and remember to like the video so we can stay motivated to bring you more great and meaningful content. Thank you for watching and supporting us.